Okay guys, welcome to week 1 module 2. For this we're going to be going over where the United States comes from and how it got to where it is now. So that means exactly what you think it means. We're going to be speed running a lot of United States history through a more foreign policy perspective. But first, just to review what we've been over already. So remember the syllabus, what US foreign policy processes are, and why the US is so unique. Okay, so what is US foreign policy process? It is how the United States decides to act or not act in relation to other states. And often it's a mix of what resources the US has, what its goals are, and how it plans to use them to achieve these goals. I like to focus on the why and how. What makes the United States so unique? We went over 4 parts of that. That was the giant economy, and because of the giant economy, the United States is able to have a giant cultural footprint, sort of in tandem with the economy, really. Another result of the giant economy is the giant military, which famously had the leadership role in World War II. In post 1945, we've got this sort of new international order, meaning that the US has this giant influence on international law, especially through the United Nations and other IOs. All right, so going over how exactly the United States got to where it is, my own undergrad professor, Dr. Jack Porter, taught about key events he called fault lines that directed the United States to become the unique case that it is. The fault lines we're going to be going over, or major crossing points. We have the American Revolution, territorial expansion, being Louisiana Purchase, Mexican-American War, and then smaller, more individual concessions, and then the Spanish-American War. World War I, World War II, or as I call it, World War I Part 2. We'll get into that. The Cold War, 9/11 and the global war on terror, and then this current era we're in, which is like a populist wave or decoupling, as some people call it. Okay, so kicking off is the American Revolution. At the time, I'm sure you know how many British colonies were in the Americas? 18. A lot of people cite 13, but only 13 rebelled. So that's depending on when you count the beginning. I would say 1776, others say 1765 to 1783. It established the United States as an independent state, uniquely including expansions on ideas such as consent to the governed. And not to say consent to the governed didn't exist before the United States. I think one of the first instances is the Magna Carta, but that wasn't consent of the governed from all, it was just consent of the governed from nobility. So the other part the United States had was equality under the law. And then it had protections from the government, meaning the Bill of Rights. So what a lot of people don't realize about the US Constitution is the Bill of Rights gives protections from the government, and the rest of the Constitution really just sets up what the government is. So Bill of Rights is what the government cannot do. And if you look at it in that sort of sense, then there's that common theme through all the Bill of Rights. It can't unreasonable search and seizure. It can't violate free speech, can't violate free press. You get the idea. Importantly, these were the first major colonies to win a rebellion against the European powers. And by colonies, I mean colonies in the New World, or the Americas. And sort of a fun fact about the American Revolution, one of Washington's generals was, I believe his name's Henry Knox. who was such a big deal that a fantastic town in Tennessee was named after him. Another thing that made the American Revolution so unique was its long-term success. People think of the French Revolution as just one event, but it really wasn't. There were several smaller French revolutions trying to get different French republics together. The one everyone thinks of actually ended with what's called the Reign of Terror, where Robespierre is going around chopping people's heads off for small or inconsequential reasons. The fact that the United States didn't devolve into that kind of mess is really what makes the American Revolution so much more unique. And why the American Revolution was so much more successful than the French was sort of one of the big questions behind Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America. He's a French guy sent to America to understand why American democracy was working while it wasn't in France. There were a lot of reasons that he came up with. Most of them are pretty valid. The common through line is that America had a clean state, a clean slate, whereas France had centuries and centuries of grievance and other institutions that it had to contend with. The next phase we have is territorial expansions. The United States is a fledgling but stable democracy, and it wants to grow. So for one of the big parts is the Louisiana Purchase. I believe it's the single largest expansion of land in the United States, and it happens fairly early in its history, 1803. Remember, the United States declared its independence in 1776, so this isn't that far after. And then, of course, there's the war that nobody really talks about. There's an old YouTube comedy video about this war. No one knew what it's about or really what's going on. I even forget what year it is. The War of 1812. It's a joke. But it's an attempt by the British to recapture the United States. Famously, the White House is burned. By Canadians, which doesn't really play into what people think of as Canadians nowadays. You have Andrew Jackson and the Battle of New Orleans. The big thing, though, is that it's one of the last, at least within North America, the last big push for European powers. Remember, the War of 1812 was in, you guessed it, 1812. So 1823, there's something called the Monroe Doctrine, which the United States decides it's going to be sort of the arbiter of the New World and is going to do everything it can to keep out European powers and allow this sort of clean slate that de Tocqueville is talking about take hold. And this would have to be a class all on its own, but we have the Mexican-American War ending in 1848 with Mexico conceding a bunch of territory given to it by Spain. Being another major land grab for the United States, and finally connecting it to the Pacific Ocean. If any of y'all remember the riots last summer in Los Angeles, a lot of it was Make America Mexico Again. And that's what they're referencing, is that for roughly 15 years, Mexico had control of that area. But going beyond that, we have all these different land acquisitions. The last major one being Hawaii in 1898. And then what we think of as the continental United States is finally formed. Now, Hawaii and I believe Alaska aren't states until later, but we at least get an idea of what the current map looks like. Now, I don't want to downplay the importance of the Civil War, but in terms of foreign policy, there wasn't a ton going on because the Civil War was America versus America. Um, Unless you want to count the Confederate States as a country, which the whole point of the war was not doing that. The only major foreign policy thing going on was the British and other European powers were watching with keen interest, looking to see if they could invade again if America did, or if the United States did end up tearing itself apart. Soon after, there's the Spanish-American War, which Spain loses and ends up losing Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. And yeah, the Philippines we don't really think of as ever being part of the United States, and it never actually was. It's complicated. Also parts of Cuba. Beyond that, though, it's I believe the last major presence of a European power in the New World. Now, Puerto Rico and Guam are both important. So are the spots in Cuba. But what I want to talk about is the exception to all that, which was colonization of the Philippines. A big issue with that is that the Philippines had already declared its independence from Spain before Spain sold it to the United States as part of the treaty. So we have the United States, who doesn't have a huge stake in the Philippines. They're looking to expand into Asia because they think it's going to be a bigger market than it is at the time. And it was never considered a territory, but a colony. Now, if you know how the United States began, you can maybe see where this starts to become a problem. Unlike Guamanians and Puerto Ricans, Filipinos were not citizens and had fewer rights overall. Legally, the Philippines did not belong to the US, but it had very little sovereignty or ability to make its own decisions. But as part of that deal, the limitations on sovereignty did have an expiration date. So this was early 1900s. The expiration date was actually 1944, which unfortunately for the Philippines, when that expiration date hit, they had already been conquered by Imperial Japan in World War II. I shall return, the famous Douglas MacArthur quote. So it was, as you can probably tell, 1944. 1945, Japan has its unconditional surrender. Philippines is given back to the US, but shortly after, it's granted independence in 1945. And this is where there's sort of a weird correlation between the United States and a book called Animal Farm. You probably have read it in high school, or at least know what it's about. It's not a very complicated book. It's very, very short, too. But for those who aren't in the know or need a refresher, Animal Farm is about a bunch of, you guessed it, farm animals who have a revolution against their farmer, and then it turns into a dystopian hellhole, very similar to how it was living under the farmer. It's By the end of the book, the pigs that have led the revolution and the sort of the leadership class are indistinguishable from farmers. They literally become the farmers and landowners that they rebelled against. And the author George Orwell is not subtle about this. You probably also know him for 1984. But the book is heavily based off of the Bolshevik Revolution in Imperial Russia, how it became the Soviet Union, and the same leadership class, or the pigs in the book, went on to be a new generation of abusers. So just like how the pigs are indistinguishable from the farmers by the end, you have Stalin, who's causing famines and throwing people in gulags and summary executions. And for most people, I think that's as deep as the book gets. which is fine. I don't think Orwell intended anything beyond that. I can't speak for him. But when you look at that sort of relationship with revolutions, you see that a lot of revolutions end up betraying their purpose to different degrees. So while it was never as bad as the Soviet Union and its famines, we have a revolution, starts with good intentions, and then ends up betraying those intentions to some degree. So you're probably wondering, Paul, you absolute genius, what does this have to do with the Philippines? Well, in this whole theme that revolutions end up betraying their ideals to some degree, different degrees, but to some degree, you have a state that began being pretty anti-colonialism, about as anti-colonialism as you can get, not long after actively participating in colonialism. The Philippines was the only colony the United States ever had, but goes to say that it doesn't have a perfect record. But after the European powers are more or less kicked out of the Americas, the United States is happy to just say this isolated, tough guy in the Americas watching over everything. Now you might think this is a photo of Strider or Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, but no, that's just a photo of how I dress when I'm, out and around town. And not to say nothing's going on during this period of isolationism, it's just mainly set within the Americas. So you have Teddy Roosevelt and his famous walk softly but carry a big stick, and his expansion into Latin America, most famously the construction of the Panama Canal. So around this time, late 1800s, early 1900s, there's this book going around that's very, very, very influential, called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, by an author named Alfred Thayer Mahan or Mann. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. But his point within the book is that navies are really underutilized within global strategy, especially as the world becomes flatter. So the United States developed something called the Great White Fleet in the early 1900s, and it's meant to show the rest of the world, especially the Europeans, that the United States is strong, independent, and that further expansion into the Americas is a bad idea. And it ends up not working out super well, because while the United States is able to build this huge fleet, it's normal ships, whereas the UK comes out with the HMS Dreadnought, which sucks up all the oxygen in the room. It's the first idea of what a modern battleship can be. And as we talked about with the last module, this is sort of the age of the battleship we're going into. At the same time, the PR victory of the HMS Dreadnought over the Great White Fleet isn't the worst thing, and the US is still mainly content to be isolationist, or at the very least just focused on the New World. So while the United States is focused on cowboys and building the Panama Canal, there's actually quite a lot going on in Europe that I'm going to explain with Shiba Inu Doge memes. First, you have Russia, France, UK, Serbia, Italy, Austria, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. All these are European powers. People would argue about Turkey, but it's part of the EU, so we're going to count it. And what's going on is this alliance entrapment issue. We'll go into that. So first is Austria and Germany have a ton in common, and Germany's just unified under Bismarck. So they decide to form an alliance together. Austria then forms an alliance with Italy. And so if Germany goes to war, Austria is going to follow it, and now Italy is too. So Italy's like, yeah, might as well become allies with Germany, and sort of a transitive alliance, like the transitive property in math. The ally of my ally is my ally. Uh, to balance this out, Russia and France become allies. Not because they have any specific beef with Germany, but in case they do, they want to be able to rely on each other. Shortly after, France and the UK have an alliance. And then by the same sort of transitive property, Russia and the UK form an alliance. And this gets tricky because remember, the ally of my ally is my ally, even if you don't want to be allies with them. Russia becomes allies with Serbia in 1914. Oh gosh, guys, what began in 1914? Can you think of it? Russia kind of saw Serbia as a little brother almost, and so it made sense to ally with it. In response, Austria and Bulgaria became allies. I think we can all tell where this is going. And because of that, you have the Ottoman Empire, what's now known as Turkey, joining in too. And then by sort of another, not really transitive property, but Ottoman Empire and Germany become allies. So we have what's essentially a powder keg going on. And these two neighbors don't like each other very much. So all it's really going to take to have a huge issue in Europe is a little spark to light this powder keg. And I'm just gonna read the meme out to you, but it's yo past the FNM 1910. Friend, you better not kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and start a chain of events leading to World War I. Me. I think it's an outdated meme, but it's still pretty funny. But yeah, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife are killed, which essentially lights the powder keg. And that causes war between Serbia and Bulgaria, causing a chain of events that has states that are next to each other, but part of different alliance webs at war. So everyone on the Bulgaria side is at war with everyone on the Serbia side of this alliance, these alliance webs, which means states with basically no issues with each other, no substantive issues at least, like France and Italy, who are next to each other, now have to be at war. And coming out of this, of all these states, there's one state especially that has the most experience with war because it recently unified. So it's got a lot of veterans, it's got a lot of battlefield experience, and these fighters are super, super, super proud and super, super effective. And that is Germany. And later on, of course, the United States shows up. So I know this is very high school, but we're all aware that World War I was not a nice time. Literally hundreds of people died. Just joking, obviously way more than hundreds of people died. I believe something around like 1/3 of French men died. So just absolutely horrible time. Because it was so brutal, Germany is expected to pay reparations. Not because it has any specific blame, but because people are especially mad at Germany for being such effective fighters within the war. Now, I think you know where this is going, so don't feel bad for Germany for too long. But ordered to pay these massive reparations, there's this hyperinflation in Germany. This is one of my favorite illustrations of how bad it was. Money was cheaper than wallpaper. So it made sense for a lot of people to paper their walls with Deutschmarks. That's how bad inflation was at the time. And we went over this in the last module. The League of Nations was founded in response to the brutality of World War One. Sort of the brainchild of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who ended up losing control of it in sort of a Frankenstein sense, meaning he had this creation that he lost control of. Um, that being said, as we all know from the last class, the League of Nations was super successful. This organization made to prevent war, 100% success rate, and there's never ever a single war again. Obviously, I'm joking. And what people don't realize about Germany in World War One, and especially after World War One, is that what it meant to be German was still very much in question. Germany wasn't unified until 1871 under Bismarck. And so you have all these different groups: Prussians, Bavarians, Saxons, uh, Upper and Lower Germans, that are all able to live together, but there's still not a clear consensus of what German is. And of course, after World War II, it's split in half until the fall of the Soviet Union. So you still see this fragmentation within German society. The only thing that really unifies Germans is their blame for the war. And people are able to use that in this chaos of these interwar years. And so what happens is that there's this big, it's called a push, or what's essentially a coup by these radical German right wingers. And they are led by um, a guy who ends up going to prison and then writing a very controversial book called Mein Kampf. And I'm sure you can guess who this is. And so Adolf Hitler adopts the fascism that began with Italian leader Benito Mussolini, who himself took the fascist ideas from ancient Rome or imperial Rome. So you see a lot of the similar iconography, especially with the eagles and what's a fasces, or this bundle of sticks with an axe in it. He mixes that with German veterans and effectiveness in war, and a strong dose of anti-Semitism, because in a lot of German society, it was believed that Jewish people were the reason they lost the war. And this is what kicks off World War II. Of course, we all know the broad strokes of World War II. It's especially sold in the United States as sort of America coming in at the 11th hour and saving the day. Which isn't entirely inaccurate. It's just that half of Germany and the Axis powers really are focused on wave after wave after wave of Soviet troops attacking from the east also, um, which is sort of how Russian tactics work. It's just overwhelm them with bodies. But that's how Russian tactics work. I mean, that's how they even work in Ukraine today, and that's how they worked before the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union. But yeah, two of the biggest events are the D-Day or Normandy invasion, led by the United States, but participated in with several countries. And then from the east, you have the Soviet Union taking Berlin. And I remember, and I just corrected myself a bit, but also in the first day, I talked about how you shouldn't confuse the Soviet Union with Russia and vice versa. Well, we're about to get into that. Because we look at what's called the Battle of Berlin, or the Soviet Union flooding into Berlin, effectively ending the war. There's the famous flag over the Reichstag. And it's, for a lot of people, what kicks off VE Day, or Victory Over Europe. But I want you to take a look, and it's Wikipedia, so I don't know how much you can trust it, but if you take a look at sort of the broad strokes of the Battle of Berlin, I'm going to give you a second. Is there anything particular that you notice about how, well, let's say the army composition for this? All right, you might have noticed that for the units involved, we have the first Belarusian front. Belarusian means from Belarus. the Second Belarusian Front, Ukrainian Front, and then 2 Polish armies. None of those are Russian fronts. So even like modern day Russia tries to take credit for ending World War II, but where it's really Belarus, Ukraine, and the Polish, under the flag of the Soviet Union, which was led by mostly ethnic Russians. And of course, we all know the Battle of Berlin ends with Adolf Hitler killing himself in his bunker, effectively ending the war, at least within Europe. And sort of from the leadership you see, or at least the dominant positions you see from the Eastern and Western fronts of World War II, we have the seeds of what would become the Cold War. Of course, one side led by the United States, the other side led by the Soviet Union. And of course, one of the key innovations coming from World War II was the atomic bomb or nuclear bombs, which have this huge impact in how global foreign policy is done, especially for nuclear armed countries. So, first country to get nuclear weapons is, of course, the United States. Some of the secrets are sold to the Soviet Union by 2 Americans, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. This was so controversial that these are 2 of the few people to ever be put to death for treason. I think it's the last case, actually. Small note though, but when politicians call each other traitors, they are effectively calling for the death penalty. People don't realize that treason is still a capital offense. But because of that, the Soviet Union shortly after gets nuclear weapons also. And that locks in sort of the mood that controls the sort of Cold War fervor. See, you don't want to, for very obvious reasons, go directly to war with a country that has nuclear weapons, but you still have to resolve your disputes somehow. And we can't use democracy or words or anything like that. That's too simple. Being sarcastic, obviously. So what war is takes a very different approach to what World War II looks like. It's not about fighting directly with your rivals anymore. It's about going through your rivals' non-nuclear allies and vice versa. So here's a quote and a photo from a very cheesy video game series called Metal Gear Solid, about sort of the vibe going on with this. But you have guerrilla warfare, black ops, spies, proxy wars, and invasions of non-nuclear allies. And there's 3 big ones that we're going to go over. Now, these are all about different types of control, right? And so we have the Korean Peninsula, which a lot like Germany is split in half of it given to the Soviet Union, half of it given to the other Allied powers. Both sides of Korea are given independence rather quickly, but because of their different backing and positioning, North and South Korea, as they become known, almost instantly go to war with each other. And this leads to the Korean War. The United States and the Soviet Union, like I said, can't go into direct war. So very shortly, it's the United States versus the Soviet Union. Very quickly, the Soviet Union backs out, and North Korea is about to lose. They're pushed up to the very top of the country, up in the mountains. And then, of all countries, China comes to back up North Korea and almost wins the war for North Korea. The Southern forces and their allies, the Americans, or the UN, are pushed all the way down to Busan. Eventually, there's a stalemate at the 30th parallel. There's a similar but not the same situation in Vietnam. America gets directly involved. The Soviet Union is supporting the northern forces. So it's not really about control of Vietnam. Before the war broke out, of course, most Americans couldn't point to Vietnam on a map or didn't even know what continent it was on. But it was still this very, very controversial moment in American history, and it was the first major defeat also. And what's often called Russia's Vietnam is the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Not Russia's invasion, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Which is, of course, very similar. Instead of American helicopters shooting guerrillas from helicopters, you have the Soviet Union shooting guerrillas from helicopters. United States backs them up the same way the Soviet backed up the North Vietnamese, giving them the Stinger missile launchers that sort of became a big symbol for what the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan was. And it, of course, ends just like Vietnam did for America, a pretty embarrassing defeat for the Soviet Union. Eventually, the Cold War ends not because of military reasons, but more economic. Slowly but surely, the Soviet Union opens up, which gives it more incentive to open up, which has people questioning the totalitarian aspects from the inside. And eventually, the Soviet Union collapses. The Berlin Wall is one of the famous examples of that. But the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. And from then on, you have what's called the unipolar moment. Unipolar meaning that there's really only one major world power. The Soviet Union has collapsed. All these different states, Ukraine, Belarus, are all breaking off and becoming their own countries. What's happening to all the nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union had, just don't worry about that. But people say it goes from 1991 to 2017. Others would say it goes from 91 to 2001. It's debated. But it's the time the United States was the sole superpower in the world. No clear end to this. It was more of a tapering off, which is what happens. So do you remember what happened to those guerrillas that the Soviet Union fought against and that the United States supported during the invasion of Afghanistan? Well, they still stay armed, and due to reasons in the background, they become distinctly anti-American. Of course, at the time, they were seen as heroes. And in the last module, I said Rambo 2 has this very poorly aged ending. It turns out I guess I'm going to hell for lying because it was Rambo 3 that had it. Rambo goes to, this is in the 80s, Rambo goes to Afghanistan to help the Mujahideen fight the Soviets. And the Mujahideen is the name of these guerrillas. And we can tell it's poorly aged because they would go on to become the Taliban. In a related group, the Al-Qaeda in 2001 commits the September 11th attacks that we're all familiar with, almost 3,000 deaths. And this is what really kicks off what's called the global war on terror. And it's when the United States, at least the international community, seems to really overplay its hand. A group that had very little to do with Iraq ends with the United States invading Iraq in sort of the post 9/11 fervor. And keep in mind, this is all under, or mostly under, two presidents, George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And so this global war on terror ends up leaking out from Afghanistan to Iraq to all over these different, mainly Muslim majority countries. Or at least countries with sizable Muslim populations, in the Philippines case. And it really starts to annoy not only the international community, but a lot of Americans too. So why are presidents able to do this? Because they're commander-in-chief. So before 9/11, it was still normal for presidents to go to war without congressional approval. They just wouldn't call it war, they would call it a conflict. But Korea, Vietnam technically aren't wars. The last time the United States declared war was after Pearl Harbor in 1941. What this is a huge push into the world, bombing people that most of the world doesn't like, and that most Americans didn't support. And while you have the United States extending heavily into the developing world, a state that says it is still developing, I would consider it developed. China has what's probably the biggest PR victory, I would say probably in world history, with the 2008 Beijing Olympics. If you get a chance to look up what this opening ceremony looks like, I don't really know how to describe it, to be honest. I was 16 when it happened, and a lot of people, myself included, went to bed scared, like, oh, China's going to rise and take over the entire world. Um, it had been like a footnote or sort of in the background of most of world history. But then with this opening ceremony and how people could see how effective China was at organizing things, it really launched it to the status as a major rival to the United States, which is, I know, kind of weird for an Olympic ceremony. And not long after this, you have the rise of Xi Jinping, the current chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, or general secretary, um, who is unique even among other general secretaries in China because his term was supposed to end 4 years ago, and he's still in power today. Um, Mainly because he's so wildly popular within China, and he's part of that is due to his major success in expanding Chinese power. Now, that's in 2012. Coming off of that, you've got the rest of the world getting more retracted and more populist. But populist, I mean, these countries are putting their own priorities first over the cooperative international community. The nice thing about cooperation is that as long as nobody's cheating and nobody's ruining it for everybody else, people make more money on average. People become wealthier on average. The issue is that this cooperation, due to lack of trust in each other, global war on terror, NAFTA, bad trade deals, kicked off a bunch of populist movements. So 2014, you have this big populist wave within Europe. And this map is actually wrong because the UK doesn't consider itself part of Europe. They don't use the euro, for example. But then you have Bolsonaro shortly after in Brazil, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Abe Shinzo in Japan, Modi, sort of the Hindu nationalists in India, and then within the UK you even have Brexit, or the UK voting to leave the European Union. And of course, in the United States, we have our own blend of populism around this time. He gets into politics 2015, around the same time as all these populist waves everywhere else in the world, winning a surprise election in 2016, but the current president, Donald Trump. And one of the unique cases, she never won office. I don't know if she even runs anymore, despite Macron, the current president of France, being super unpopular. Marie Le Pen, and this was sort of a staple of especially 2017, basically until 2024. But we would always hear about a new leader coming out of a country who is right-wing populist, and they'd always be called the Trump of France, or Duterte is like the Trump of the Philippines, or Abe is the Trump of Japan. Um, but what's sort of weird about this is that it sort of implies that Trump came first. But what had actually been happening is that there's always been this sort of populist root within the world that was just more activated by what we would say or think of as either too much cooperation or too little cooperation during the unipolar moment, depending on how you want to parse that out. That's no small scholarly debate there as to what caused the big populist wave. But like I said, it implies that Trump came first, where Marie Le Pen, especially in France, um, did start running in, I believe, this populist wave, but that was just because her father got too old. Um, Her father, who has the same exact politics as her, had been running for president, sorry, of France since 1974. So, like I said, there's always been this populist route that's just become more activated. Okay, so where's the US now? Of course, we've had COVID, which affected all of us. Um, Weird thing is, in a lot of sort of, especially US foreign policy and international relations, it sort of put everything on ice, at least for a little bit. For a lot of us, COVID didn't really end until we had something to worry about, right? Vaccines had gone in arms, but there was still the different variants of COVID that came out. I was always wondering if there's ever going to be a Sigma variant. I thought that would be very funny. I don't think there ever was, though. Well, some would say because of 9/11, other would say because the US response to 9/11 was so unpopular. Um, since 2001, 2002, maybe the invasion of Iraq, and 2003, the United States favorability has gone significantly down since that weird post 9/11 Bush paranoia. And it's never really recovered. So it's always hovering internationally around 50%, sort of regressing to that average. But that's an important caveat is that this is just talking about the United States. So where are we now? Yeah, like I said, global favorability has been around 50-50. Um, it's sort of known for having a large, overextended military, strong economy due to the US dollar being the reserve currency. I know the economy doesn't feel super strong for everybody right now, but it's mainly being backed up by the fact that the US dollar is the reserve currency. And we went over what that was in Module 1. Founding leadership roles in most IOs. So even if we have what people think of as hypocritical or inconsistent foreign policy, um, because we're in these leadership roles, it's very much a do what I say, not what I do type attitude a lot of the time. And strong cultural relevance. But all those are more criticisms of the US government rather than Americans. And kind of like how US favorability is 50-50, it sort of goes with the government and with the people. American tourists are, I think, more seen in America than the rest of the world as being sort of annoying. Um, the two on the left are different movies. In Bruges, which is, I believe, an Irish movie, and then the one below it is a French movie, and they portray very negative stereotypes of Americans. You have these travel vloggers and social media influencers, people who will go into, if you look at the top right, people who go in and just take too many photos. And then an extreme version of that would be the people who actually go around messing with cultural or natural resources to get a good photo. So that's what's called the geisha paparazzi in Japan, where you're supposed to treat geishas with respect, but then you have people treating them like they're Disney mascots, which is not how it's supposed to work there. And then, especially in the age of social media, you have the rage baity problem vloggers. I had to Google who two of these guys were. Turns out two of them are in jail now for messing around with too many people. The two guys at the bottom. I kind of remember the guy at the top left had gone into a forest in Japan famous for having a being a popular destination for people who are going to commit suicide, and he wearing the goofy hat, massively disrespectful. There's even a trend for a little while because the invasion of Iraq was so unpopular, where a lot of especially left-leaning Americans would wear Canadian backpacks and T-shirts when they travel because they didn't want to be harassed by, especially Europeans, for being Americans. They would pretend to be Canadian. And there's an old Simpsons joke about it. But those are just stereotypes, and it's not how the real world works. I mean, most of the world's mature enough to understand that people are individuals, and just because of what you have on your passport doesn't mean you're going to co-sign everything your government does. I've got Russian friends who despise Putin. I've got Chinese friends who don't like Xi Jinping. So this is from my master's cohort, our graduation dinner. No two people from the same country in this, and just laughing along, yucking it up about how happy we are to be done with grad school. And of the 7 people in this, 4 of us still went to grad school, including me, of course, to get my PhD. That's not to say that, like, America or the United States is the only country that people really have an issue with. Just before uploading this, I found this very specific beef between Australia and Italy that I just thought was too funny to not have within the PowerPoint presentation. You can pause on it if you want. I just thought it was too funny not to include. Continuing where the US is now, much of the world is pretty quick to say, I don't like the American government, but I like Americans. And I find that to be generally true also. As true as you can be, painting an entire nation of people with such a broad brush. There are also super positive stereotypes that no one ever really talks about. The main one being that people from the US are super friendly. I mean, if you think about it, in the United States, we have a lot of immigration, of course, but a lot of people going to different countries is not that common in the United States compared to especially Europe, where one of my friends from Germany will drive through Belgium to get to his job in France. And so he's around other cultures all the time, where America is this giant country. We don't experience that many other cultures. So when we do travel, we see all sorts of unique people, and I think there's a bit more gratitude for it. Like I said, painting with a very broad brush, though. And yeah, most of the world is mature enough to know that people are individuals and they don't treat Americans much different. As long as you're polite to people, then that's really all people ask, is just to be treated with a base level of respect. I mentioned in the last module I'm going to Mongolia later this semester, and I was looking up how to be not rude in Mongolia, and the advice was absolutely hilarious. It's like, don't grab people by the shoulders and shake them. Don't touch the top of their head. Don't throw things at people from across the room. And it's like, this doesn't seem very specific to Mongolia. That seems like just being a normal person in most situations. Now, I know what you're all thinking, but Paul, you super charismatic and smart person, what about the US government? And to that I will say, with its size and situational or selective foreign policy, many people see the United States as this big international hypocritical bully who pushes other states into doing stuff they don't want to do. And this is one of the reasons for the non-American populism waves in Europe, is that other states didn't like being told what to do by the United States. Ironically, they were America first a lot of the time. Despite all that, the United States remains a popular immigration destination. And to end things on more of a joke or sort of an amusing story, 2004, so shortly after the invasion of Iraq, which, if you haven't picked up by now, is super unpopular internationally, the creators of South Park made a satire called Team America World Police, based off the idea that America tends to try to police the world, or stick its head into issues that don't concern it. The big one, of course, being the Vietnam War. But when this movie came out in 2004, of course, there's this big response from a lot of people. Oh my gosh, what an excellent satire. It's all one big metaphor. It's a very smart movie. Um, I, unless you have a really high tolerance for raunchy jokes, I would not recommend watching this movie. But what was very funny is that the theme song that's meant to make fun of American foreign policy is called America F Yeah. So we have one wave of people who see it at its intent, that it's meant to make fun of American foreign policy. But then you have this other group of people who made it an absolute meme and unironically think, America F yeah, this is the coolest thing ever, we're such a cool country. All coming from a movie that's meant to make fun of the United States. Okay, so next week we'll be going into more detail about the pre and post 1945 fault lines, American Revolution, territorial expansion, World War I, and then World War II. Don't worry if you can't remember all the dates and facts and stuff. We just need a brief overview of what exactly was going on during this time, right? Because as the course goes on, I'm going to be referencing these a lot. Same with post 1945. Just next week, we're mainly going to be going into more detail, especially about the actual policy processes and how the United States decided to do what. All right. As per usual, if you have any questions or concerns, please shoot me an email. The next module is an activity. Check Canvas for details. The only difficult parts about it will actually be forming the groups that you're going to have the rest of the semester. Because it does involve group work, if you have friends in the course, you can reach out to them and send me an email saying you want to be grouped with X or Y. Now, if I don't get an email from you or about you as to who you want in your group, I'm going to randomly assign the groups on Monday. And the assignment isn't actually due until next Friday, so you have plenty of time to do it. And the assignment shouldn't take very long at all, especially since both Module 1 and 2 have been relatively long. But yeah, look forward to hearing from y'all and give yourself a big pat on the back because we went through almost 250 years of U.S. foreign policy in just under an hour. All right. Y'all have a great weekend and stay warm in all this snow we're looking forward to.